Once again, everybody, a joy to be with you, a joy to be at this beautiful place and to hear that stunning choir. Lovely, too, to greet everyone joining us by live stream. You know, recently, in connection with an intellectual project of mine, I've been reading a lot of the writings of Dietrich von Hildebrand. Maybe not a household name, but one of the most important Catholic philosophers of the last century. Very influential on both John Paul II and Benedict XVI, von Hildebrand was, in the 1930s, identified by the Nazis themselves as their number one enemy. Pretty high praise, that. He developed a number of path-breaking ideas in the field of especially moral philosophy. Pay attention sometime to his distinction between the merely subjectively satisfying and the objectively valuable, foundational for ethics. But what's been striking me recently, and especially in light of our feast today, von Hildebrand was one of the great philosophers of the heart. He felt that in our tradition of philosophical anthropology, we put a great deal of stress on the intellect and on the will, these two great spiritual powers. If we think about the feelings or about affect or the heart, he said, we tend to think of them rather negatively. These emotions that get in the way of correct thinking, or they get in the way of correct choosing and behavior. We might even relegate the heart or the passions or feeling to the animal level, not as rarefied and spiritual as the intellect and the will. You know, one observation von Hildebrand makes I find fascinating is, how can we read the heart from the standpoint of its corruption? So sure, sometimes our emotions can blind our intellect or they can distort the will, but the mind has no distortions. You know, the history of Western philosophy, let's face it, is to a large extent the story of bad ideas. Or look at human history. Hegel referred to it as the slaughter bench of history, meaning it's the story of a lot of awfully bad choices, bad use of the will. So how can we see the heart always from the standpoint of its corruption or negativity? Von Hildebrand says the heart is the seat or center of one's affective life. And as such, it's the source of what he calls a value response. A value response. In the presence of great values, our minds are awakened, to be sure. Our minds understand them. They see patterns of meaning. In the presence of great values, our wills are awakened. We desire these things, sure. But also in the presence of great value, the heart is awakened. I mean, just think of this place where I'm standing now. I mean, my mind can take it in. There's so much here that beguiles the mind, all these harmonies and patterns and so on. My will can appreciate it as something good, something to be desired. But see, it's my heart that sings when I come into a place like this. Or think of something, a great negative value. Think of the Holocaust. I mean, our minds, our wills can engage that awful reality, but it's our heart that causes us to weep as we meditate upon the Holocaust. In other words, the heart is a way, von Hildebrand argues, of engaging reality in a very profound way. In fact, he goes so far as to say, if you're seeking the real center of a person, don't look to the mind or the will. And he's not denigrating them for a second. He fully appreciates them. But you're looking for the real center of a person, look to the heart. And of course, isn't that reflected in our ordinary experience and parlance? You know, we might engage someone with a rational argument and feel that we've won them over. Or maybe we've convinced them to follow a certain pattern of behavior. But we tend to say, I really got to him. I really got to her. when I get to the level of the heart, this deep center of the affective life, where we respond to value in a very profound way. That's the heart. Isn't it interesting now, as we reflect on this feast? Though the church certainly reverences the mind of Christ, think of St. Paul telling the Philippians, may that same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. Christ is the Logos, of course, who appeals to the mind profoundly. Though, of course, the church reverences the will of Jesus, much of the spiritual life is nothing but bringing our own wills into line with His will. Nevertheless, there is no feast of the sacred mind. There is no feast of the sacred will. But there is this feast of the sacred heart of Jesus. The church wants us to reflect profoundly on this center of Jesus' affectivity. You know, years ago when I was a philosophy student and I came across the writings of Immanuel Kant on religion for the first time, and I found Kant's description of Jesus, I remember even then I just had to laugh because Kant was clearly projecting his own rather austere personality when he said Jesus is the archetype of the person perfectly pleasing to God. In other words, he presented Jesus simply as a kind of stern, austere moral ideal. Well, I mean, is Jesus a moral ideal? Of course he is. But when you read the Gospels, you don't find that sort of Kantian reductionism. You see someone who is filled with passion, filled with emotion, characterized by a deep heart, in von Hildebrand's terms. The sacred heart of Jesus is on full display in the Gospels. I'll just give you a few examples. They're all over the place. Think of the parables of Jesus, when he often is just painting a portrait of himself. The prodigal son or the good Samaritan. Think of the father of the prodigal son who throws caution and respectability to the winds, and he goes running down the hill to embrace his lost son. The Good Samaritan, also a portrait of Jesus, whose heart is moved with compassion when he sees the suffering man. That's the heart of Jesus on display. Von Hildebrand, for example, loves this story of the wedding feast at Cana. So in the Gospel of John, the first of Jesus' signs is not the raising of the dead, it's not the curing of someone sick, it's not the forgiveness of sins. But the first of his signs is producing 180 gallons of wine for a wedding celebration. Joy, exuberance, wine that lifts up the heart. The joyfulness of God is on display there. Or think of that marvelous scene of Jesus at the home of Simon the Pharisee. And in comes the woman who, in her sense of being forgiven, is so overwhelmed that she pours out perfume on the feet of Jesus. Much to the chagrin and shock of the more staid bystanders. But Jesus, of course, praises her because that gesture of her heart spoke to his heart. Cor ad cor loquitur, as Newman said. How wonderful, by the way, Newman. No one in the Western tradition revered the mind more than Newman, but he doesn't say mens ad mentem loquitur. He says cor ad cor loquitur, his heart speaking to God's heart, our heart speaking to one another. Think of Jesus now over Jerusalem, weeping. it'd be easy enough, I suppose, for the austere Kantian moralist to pronounce judgment on the sins of Jerusalem. But it's the heart of Jesus that's poured out in the tears he sheds over Jerusalem. How about this when he says, probably to the shock of his listeners, "Do not think that I've come to bring peace upon the earth. I've come to bring not peace but the sword." What is that? But the heart of Jesus, now alive with anger at what sin has done to the world, expressing itself. At the tomb of his friend Lazarus, maybe most famously, Jesus weeps. Anyone that's ever lost a friend or lost a loved one knows exactly what that's like. And Jesus, not an austere moral exemplar, but here pouring out his heart, weeping at the tomb of Lazarus. And I love how the bystanders say, "See how he loved him." Now, I mean, they might have recognized in the direction of his will, his love for Lazarus, sure. But they saw it and they viscerally felt it in the tears of Jesus for Lazarus. Just a last example, the risen Christ, appearing to his undoubtedly frightened and confused disciples, saying, "Peace," and then inviting them to touch his wounds. Indeed, telling Thomas, "Put your hand in my side." How evocative. Touch my heart if you want. The mind of Jesus, yes, we revere it. The will of Jesus, yes, we seek to follow it. But today we celebrate the heart of Jesus, the sacred heart of Jesus, which reveals to us not simply the passionate emotions of a first century Jew, but rather the heart of God himself. The feelings of Jesus, of joy and sorrow and pity and compassion and exultation, those are the feelings of God. Therefore, the heart of Jesus is a place where God dwells. I love this from the Litany of the Sacred Heart. Cor Jesu templum Dei sanctum miserere nobis. Heart of Jesus, holy temple of God, have mercy on us. When I walked in this building, I saw in the front there that this is named quite rightly as the house of God where I am. The templum sanctum, the holy temple of God, in the fullest sense, is the cor Jesu, is the heart of Jesus, the center of his affectivity. And so here's my message in sum. Maybe I say it especially to priests who are listening. Move into the very heart of Jesus. Align the center of your affectivity with the center of his affectivity. In other words, love what he loved. Rejoice over what he rejoices over. Be sorrowful over what he's sorrowful over. Exult in the manner of his exaltation. Because when you move into the cor Jesu, you move into the heart of Jesus. You are moving into the holy temple of God.